Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering the Mage Errant series, Book 2, Jewel of the Endless Urg, Chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, Pirates, Stern Chase, Sandstorm, and Sunburn. In these chapters, I can't lie to you guys, scenes with storms don't always work for me. But my God, at the end of this Sandstorm chapter, I was exhausted. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you so much to Dan for commissioning this episode. So, I had the misfortune of reading the Sandstorm chapter right after watching a TikTok of a live orchestra performing Darude's Sandstorm, the techno classic. And that song has now been in my head for about 4 straight days, and I can't get it out. And there was a big part of me, y'all, that was tempted to get that queued up on my phone and just play that with my intro. It still might be the intro music I wind up using. I have to find it, but I just wanted you all to know that was going on through my head the whole time that I was reading this. And honestly, it worked. It kind of added some tension somehow. I don't know why, but it was effective. So I just thought I would give y'all a little sense of the atmosphere that I was experiencing. But before we get to the sandstorm, we got to deal with these pirates. So this is the pirate situation is really fascinating because I was thinking that we were going to wind up having a more one-on-one kind of, I don't know if I want to say a conversation, but that the pirates would wind up being actual distinctive characters. And they may still become that. We may reach a point where we come back around and see them again. But as of right now, the pirates are a threat that we were able to keep off and run away from. And I'm very surprised by that, but I did enjoy getting to see the ways in which everybody functions in terms of their offensive spell work. And also, I love that Talia manages to get it together long enough to fight. And this is the one sort of, she's managed to find a moment here where she's actually enjoying herself in the midst of this. I want to know if John Bierce has ever acknowledged the fact that eventually in the Sunburn chapter, Talia basically has a very similar little monologue about how much she hates sand as Mr. Darth Vader does in the prequels, because it's really close. It's very close. And for those who aren't aware, I swear to God, you guys, it's the prequels are some of the worst written dialogue scenes that I have ever encountered. It's the kind of thing that when I saw these movies very early in my experience of understanding that movies could be bad as a teenager, if you get what I mean. There was always this assumption for me, if it was made, then it must be good, because nobody would put money into something that's bad. And then I started to come around and realize oh no, movies can be bad actually. And one of the first movies that taught me that was Home Alone 2. But this was one of the ones where it was not even that I thought it was bad so much as who I was watching the dialogue and nobody was reacting in a way that made any sense. So I thought I had missed something. So he's talking to her about how much he hates sand. And she's like mooning over him like he's saying something really deep or romantic. And then there's another scene where he talks about how he killed everybody and she's more concerned for him than the fact that he just admitted to slaughtering an entire camp full of people and the women and children too. So it's just so notoriously terrible. It's quoted a lot as being really hilarious because it's so bad. And I felt like that was on purpose, right? Like, it just seemed such a pointed moment. And honestly, I'm not mad at it because that feels appropriate to Talia. Like, to be honest, it's weird that Anakin has these sorts of like monologues, but is treated as still a reasonable love interest and a balanced person. But Talia, we know, has issues with anger in general and is overall at her wit's end on this trip. So her having this moment and just being like, you know what, fuck all of this. Even Godric is like, yeah, this has really sucked for her. I would not want to be her. So we get to see the way that they fight back. So we've got Ballisti. We've got Captain Solon, who has a cutlass that has all of these like spell forms cut into it, which is dope as hell. And I love this. Alestin had decided this was an excellent learning experience for his students. Rather than instruct them on how to help defend the ship, he grinned and told them to be creative. He then returned to go confer with Captain Solon about something else. Hugh really hated it when Alestin smiled like that. And there was a mention, I think, in the chat, maybe a few episodes ago, about how similar Alestin's far-seeing is to Ethan's like bloodline gift in Cradle. And yeah, that, and then in these chapters we have him managing to keep up the ward that takes a ton of mana all by himself for several hours. We're getting a lot of parallels between the two of them. And I am really curious about the conversations between John Bierce and Will White. How have they both wound up with a character that is so similar? Are they, for those who like are much more into maybe anime and manga than I am, is this a archetype in anime of some kind, and it's not really that surprising that they both came up with a character that has such similar abilities? Or is this kind of a strange thing for them to both have? I mean, we know that there are other attunements that Alestin has, which we have not yet seen. So it may be that once I get to know him a little bit better, it's going to seem less intensely similar, but at the moment I'm just like, they are so alike. Dan says, I think it's a Wuxia archetype. Wow, I hope I said that right, because that is a word I have never laid eyes on. I don't even know what that means, Dan. I'm sorry. This is one of those where it's like you're trying to explain something to me with further terminology I don't understand, and it's like when I like try to look up how to program something on my website and they're like, oh, well, just go in here and do this and this. And I'm like, oh, I see. You are mistaken in thinking that I know what any of that means. I'm going to have to go and now look up the meanings of those words as well. But regardless, like, it's the kind of thing that I am almost wanting to avoid, getting too much more into anime and stuff so that I can hold on to the idea that these like concepts are only of the universes that I have participated in. On the other hand, I have already said, why do we all have to come up with a completely original idea? Because everything's already been done a million times and we're just doing our own version of it, and that's fine. So, Dan says, oh, wuxia is Chinese cultivation fantasy. It's where a lot of progression fantasy has its roots. Okay. So I know that cultivation fantasy is a thing. I didn't know wuxia was the like name for it. Okay. Yeah, color me surprised as well that that's like a well-known genre as well, because I only ran across Cradle was the first one I ever read, and then when I began to look for some books to listen to for fun on Audible, I ran across another one that had a really similar system, and I was just like, wait, oh my god. And then I went and read some reviews and they described it as like, cultivation magic, and I was like, oh, this is just a whole thing. So girl is ignorant, a girl is not familiar, and this is what you all are for, to get me into these universes and understanding some shit that is actually taken for granted by a lot of people but is still really new to me. And I'm going to be very interested like on that topic to cover Cradle with Rashawn, because I'm pretty sure it's going to be entirely new to her as well, but we'll see. So this, like, the scene here is Hugh trying to figure out how he's going to use wards here to his advantage. He is like still not really able to wield a lot of offensive spells, particularly in particular. He has cantrips, but those don't really work for this. And this is interesting. Drawing wards on a moving object was miles more difficult than drawing them on something stationary. Wards had a tendency to decay and fail explosively when physically moved around too much. Hugh had begun studying how to build wards that were more resistant to movement, but only just, so he was much more limited than usual in his choice of ward, which is a really wild thing to hear about on this side of the labyrinth, where he just had a bunch of like little warded stones banging around in a pouch right near his nether regions, which are very delicate. Wow. Hugh, you got lucky, man. So very lucky. So he's crafting this huge ward, and it says he stared at the stick of chalk he had in his pocket. He doubted if he could craft a ward around the entire ship in the time he had. And then he smiles and is like, oh, I don't need to. And he goes up to the prow of the ship. The instant the first smaller ship pulled alongside the Owl, both let loose with bolts from crossbows and ballistae, as well as all sorts of magical assaults. Every single one of them was deflected by shields of wind that rose up around the ships. The problem was that maintaining wind shields large enough and powerful enough to protect an entire ship was incredibly draining. On top of that, wind shields significantly reduced the amount of wind making it into the ship's sails, slowing them quite a bit. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. So now you're like kind of at a standstill, protecting yourself from like the assault, but allowing them to gain on you more quickly. Don't like that. Hugh frantically drew spell forms on the prow of the ship. He needed to get this done before a lightning bolt slammed through the windshield, hardly affected, and shattered a portion of the railing on the right side of the ship. Hugh flinched, almost ruining his spell forms. Not all magic was troubled by windshields. He needed to get the ward done before the windshield went down. And then we go to Talia's POV. And she is trying to figure out how to get past the windshield because everything she's been doing hasn't been working. Clan Castus had fought more than its fair share of wind mages, and Talia's family had often told her the techniques they'd used. The Owl's windshield wasn't a problem. any decent wind mage could craft a shield that detected and parted for spells coming from the inside. So she is struggling here with not vomiting and also fighting. And she's doing it. It's not ideal. I wouldn't want to be her. So she begins to manifest Dreamfire. Rather than launch a Dreamfire bolt immediately, Talia began focusing more and more mana into the purple-green flames. She kept the Dreamfire focused in as small a sphere as possible. That sort of thing wouldn't be possible for most people. Talia's tattoos didn't just enhance the power of flame spells, they also increased her range, control, and even the flexibility of her spells. Talia was far, far more flexible than other attuned mages, so long as she was trying to destroy things with fire. Which, there is something kind of beautiful about the fact that, like, yeah, I'm just, only if I'm doing this one thing, but there's a lot of different ways that I can do that. And she's thinking about the fact that Alestin has been trying to get her to hold more spell forms in her head at once. And he's saying that'll be helpful for ranged combat. And she's like, I don't really get how, but he has been right about most other things. So I guess I'll trust him with it. And I really like this because what I keep thinking about, there's a scene in the Dresden Files. Those of you who have read that series will know what I'm talking about. Dresden's signature spell that he uses in combat is Fuego. And it's just basically shooting a bolt of fire. And it's a very draining, kind of messy spell. And even though he has a lot of raw power behind it, he freely admits that there are other people who are able to focus their power a lot better than him. And that there's a lot of unnecessary splashing around of power so that it isn't conserved very well. And eventually, in, I think, the 6th book, he finally shows us, the author, some of the people from the council and the way they fight. And there's a character named Lucio, whose bolts are essentially these pencil thin, laser pointed bolts of fire that are incredibly efficient and don't drain his energy or don't drain her energy. And Dresden is just left watching her God damn, that is so tidy and so precise. She doesn't burn half a car while trying to hit somebody. He's using a bazooka and she's got 22 caliber bullets, basically, is the vibe. And that sounds kind of like what Alestin is attempting to get her to do, but she doesn't seem to see the value in that, because she does being able to just make things explode in a ball of fire, as it turns out she can do with these this bone thing, which is so cool. Honestly, it's very creepy and I really like it. So Talia envisioned a relatively simple spell form connecting the other 3. Once she pumped mana into it, all 3 would launch simultaneously. And as she's about to do it, there's a lurch, and it's sent a little bit sooner than she intended. The cone on the outside hardly lasted any time at all before it got dissolved in the windshield, but it did get the other several inches through. The next layer began dissolving just as fast, but thanks to its mana density maintenance, it stayed largely intact through the rest of the windshield, only dissolving into a shower of sparks at the very end. The dense core of the compound Dreamfire bolt punched through the last part of the windshield, hardly losing any of its Dreamfire. If the owl hadn't lurched and Talia's aim had been true, it would have slammed right into the main mist. Instead, it hammered right into the forward ballista. I keep wanting to say ballista, and I'm I don't remember which one is which, if I'm saying that right. If Talia had used regular fire, it likely would have just exploded. Dreamfire, however, was seldom so predictable. Instead, it began to hum, and it gets so loud so quickly, and everybody's clutching their ears, and all of a sudden, it stops, and the ballista just begins to break apart. Every piece of wood on the thing collapsed into fibrous strands, leaving a curious pile of fibers with a few bits of metal jutting out of the pile. The decking around it looked somewhat fibrous as well. Talia, however, saw none of this as she was puking off the back of the ship. The windshield, unfortunately for her, did not recognize vomit as a spell. "Oh, baby. Oh, hon, I'm so sorry." That is just really unfair. Poor Talia. She has really been put through it. So then we go to Sabe and Godric. I don't want to do too much beat for beat because I'm already, 20 minutes into this and I'm still in chapter 6 here. But there's a lot that each of them is beginning to really perfect here. He is blocking crossbow bolts, and he wasn't thinking that it was going to be as hard as it turns out to be, but it's actually using a lot more mana than he anticipates. And then he starts blocking as they're coming at them, and he's realizing, wait, I don't actually have to wait until these are fired at us to defend against them. Godric pushed on the head of the bolt as the ballista's crew prepared it to fire. Since it was higher up than him, the front of the bolt flipped up into the air, which in turn managed to release the drawstrings of the ballista. The drawstring caught the twisting base of the bolt, somehow managing to send it twirling backward. It ended up slamming point first into the mainmast, where it stuck, trembling. Godric would never have believed that had happened if he hadn't done it. So he keeps doing this, and it's working for a minute until they get a lot of attention. And then, let's see. Godric would have been turned to ash if Sabe hadn't stepped in front of him, deflecting the bolt of lightning with both hands. She'd been constantly drilled by Alustin to be able to deflect lightning safely since the labyrinth. "Watch yourself, kid," the captain called. He hurled the lightning bolt back against the side of the larger ship, then knocked an enemy firebolt out of the air with his cutlass. And again, I just think this cutlass thing sounds so cool. I don't know. I really, really like this whole idea. And I love when Godric is seeing that another bolt is coming at Sabe, and then he is ready to try and save her, and it just hits her own windshield, and she's able to block it easily, and he's like, oh, thank God. I am wondering if he has kind of got a thing for Sabe, because of there's just a sort of vibe I've been getting, but I don't know. I am not completely averse to there being romantic stuff happening within our group, but also I have worries about it, naturally, because this stuff can be written in a way that isn't super fun, at least for me. So just putting it out there that I was sort of wondering about it, but I'm also aware that it's not necessarily there. We also don't get a ton of boys and girls can just be friends, and there isn't anything romantic in this sort of story where kids are this age and they are together all the time and training all the time. Even in Harry Potter, she was going to have Harry and Hermione be a thing. She wound up with it being Ron instead, which was a terrible idea. Honestly, neither of them was good enough for Hermione, but that's fine. But I just wanted to mention it. y'all know that it's not even just in terms of like YA. I just find romance to be something that's really hard to get right. And I don't respond super well to the majority of it that I wind up coming across in fiction. So it's always something that I'm kind of eyeballing, and I'm like, I'm open to it, but beware, I'm kind of a tough sell. So this is when we go back to Hugh with his wards. And what is this intended to do? I'm fairly certain I didn't teach you most of these runes except for the ones that stabilize moving wards. They're going to redirect the wind hitting us from the front upwards. According to the book, that should create a patch of lower density in the air ahead of the ship, and we'll get pulled into it. And Alustin says, have you developed far-seeing? And he says, why? No reason. And I was like, is he talking about the sandstorm coming? Like, I wasn't entirely sure what this means. But anyway, so then we have Talia pulling out these shards of bone. The mana felt sluggish, angry, and full of knives. It hurt to draw on those reservoirs, and she still wasn't exactly sure what was going on when she did. More terrifyingly, Alustin had no clue either. I did not care about that. I don't like it. I don't want this to be anything that's like weirdly drawing on her own bones or something. I just don't like the sound of it. And I just don't like it. I'm just saying. So they begin to grow and heat up. By the time they hit the sand, they were the size of her torso. And then they reach the size of Godric. They gouge into the pirate ship, and hunks of bone exploded. The pirate's right runner gave way completely, and the whole ship seemed to crumple forward. The mainmast tore itself loose from the ship entirely, falling into the sand and carrying several pirates with it. And then she begins vomiting again. I love that she's able to take some time out from her vomiting to just be a complete badass here. It's insane. So the pirates begin to chase them. And as it, like, we find out that this is probably due to the fact that they have lost some people, it's interestingly sort of glossed over that people probably died, but it's not like they ignore that. It's like mentioned, but not dealt with that much, which is fine. And somehow the owl had accelerated forward at an absurd rate. And this is when his ward manages to go into effect. And he tells Sabe, I couldn't have done this without you, because this is a version of one of the wards in the book that your grandmother had written, the one that you gave me. And when she is like, oh, this is how wind mages fly, the use of sort of a vacuum pulling forward, he's like, oh, I thought it was wind pushing you from behind. And she says that that's really hard to control and takes a lot of effort, which I thought made a lot of sense. So then the sandstorm. Now this, you guys, was just... Sandstorms are one of those things that turn up in a lot of adventure series because so many of them are like, let's go to, you know, remote locales in deserts and do something that's like a little bit different that a lot of people won't necessarily experience. So it feels really outlandish. And I don't feel like sandstorms, as depicted a lot, especially in movies, don't really deal with the reality of what it means to be in a weather event that could like strip the flesh off of you. You know, people are getting buffeted around and like there's clearly wind and stuff going on, but the actual issue of the sand itself, they kind of ignore, and people are able to like be out and not hurt by it in a way that is that's the point. That's what makes sandstorms so scary. And the only time that you really get to see it do what it does is if like a bad guy winds up being in a certain position, and then they get theirs. But the heroes can often be sort of like fast and loose with whether they're able to stick a hand out there or be out there for, you know, a few moments saving somebody or whatever. And so I really appreciated how much attention is paid to the reality of that here. And also I really felt for Hugh, because Hugh, basically Alustin is like, we are going to go straight through the storm. And he points at Hugh and is like, he can do it. Hugh has my full confidence. And Hugh is just like, oh my God. Okay. So, Sabé wanted to make sure, let's see. Sabé wanted to make Ava think it was a sure thing. So she throws in and she's like, yeah, he definitely can do it. Sabé noticed Delia eyeing her again. The old woman cocked an eyebrow slightly at her. This lady is on to the fact that Sabé is trying to play matchmaker, I think, a little bit here. And she doesn't seem to have a problem with it. But she's definitely sort of looking at her in a way that's like, girl, what are you doing? Because I get that you are hoping that the two of them hook up, but are you about to just pretend that we're safe in a sandstorm to accomplish that? So Hugh has to draw on the deck with chalk, and this dude is going at a pace that is causing him great physical pain eventually, but he can't stop. And he gets it all the way around, and then he realizes he had misestimated the size, the like circumference of the ship, and there is a gap in it, and it won't close the way that it's supposed to. And let's see, I'm trying to find this spot here. Okay, here it is. Hugh, what's wrong? You've been staring at that section for ages. I miscalculated. There's no room for another full spell form here. Isn't there something else you could put there? And then he's like, oh shit. And a part of me thought Alustin, like, I'm wondering about his farseeing and exactly how that works. But did he know that this was going to be the solution that Hugh came up with? Because Hugh at the last moment winds up adding a part of the ward here that will allow anybody to contribute their mana to keep it going. And what had originally been happening in his mind was that he was going to power the whole ward himself. And spoilers, this ward takes a whole lot more mana than he is anticipating. So he begins to power it on his own initially after adding this little bit into it, and suddenly begins to feel really tired. And when he checks internally, he realizes that it's draining mana extremely quickly. And thus, the fact that he had to add in this little like addendum, which allows anybody to fuel it, is low-key what winds up sort of saving their lives, because otherwise it would have been a couple, like, seems like maybe a couple hours max that he would have been able to keep it up. And the storm lasts considerably longer than that. So everybody has to take turns fueling it. And that's when we get the bit with Alustin and him having like these giant mana reserves. And Hugh is sort of like, wow, and I thought mine were big, but I guess it's only in comparison with other students. And that's what it must be like for like battle mages. And I was sort of wondering if like that is typical for battle mages, or if this is just something that is specific to Alustin. And the description of this whole storm and how tired everyone is, how relentless the storm is, how loud, and the fact that they like can't talk to each other. Afterward, when they finally come out of it, his ears are ringing, so they're talking and they still can't really hear very well because their ears are ringing. And let's see, more than once the ship had fallen unsupported, whether ramping off the side of a dune, having it collapsed out from under them, or even being carried a distance up into the air by the wind. So Godric just waited, comforting Talia in her misery by the light of his lonely little cantrip. And that just sounds like a fucking nightmare to me. This is the sort of thing that I think about a lot in terms of people immigrating to the United States from Europe. And the fact that like people did that shit voluntarily, and how you're in these little fucking, they're so small and there are so many people crammed onto them, and you're absolutely at the mercy of weather and God knows what else. And I think it's remarkable that as many people made it across as did. I have gone and toured some of those ships in Connecticut. They have a sort of festival, I guess, Tall Ships Festival. And they had a lot of like either actual antique ships or reproductions. And you could walk onto them and tour them. And I swear to God, y'all, these bitches were not large. It is wild. It's a nightmare scenario to me to be like bound up in this small area to begin with. But then they have to be like below decks in the dark. And because like in a real storm in real life, you weren't allowed to have a lantern lit because the danger of fire was so huge. So you had to be down there in the dark, waiting it out and helpless. Just fucking kill me. Literally. Oh my God. No. So thankfully, because they're inside this wild sandstorm, at the very least, the ether is thicker here. So they are able to like process that and have more mana more quickly. But nevertheless, it is a really rough time. And when they finally come out on the other side of it, everybody is exhausted. Hugh needs to take some extra time to sleep. And he is, I really appreciated this. Delia wakes him up because he's fallen asleep on deck and he's going to get a bad sunburn, which he winds up getting anyway. But as somebody who fell asleep in mid-morning on a beach in Costa Rica and wound up with sun poisoning, that shit is no joke. So, and the Moonless Owl has taken some damage from the battle, and the storm like just fucks it up even worse. And they wind up sort of stopping, taking a break, resetting all of the cargo. And there's this moment that I really liked where, let's see, the elderly cook had only cleaned up some of the mess in the galley when Hugh wandered down to get something to eat, but he gladly took a break from cleaning to praise Hugh and whip him up a quick meal. It was some sort of finely chopped meat mixed with vegetables, all wrapped up in thick flatbread and just as heavily spiced as everything else Hugh had eaten on board. And I am going to just say that I think this is a hero, like a lamb hero, and because he was called a hero earlier, that this is a little bit of a joke from Mr. Bierce. And I don't know if that's real and if I just made it up, and I might have, but I don't care. I think it's funny. They gave the hero a hero, and that is what he did. That's what happened. So then we go into chapter 9. And Talia is struggling with walking in the sand because Hugh has been pulled to go have a lesson with Candaron, and he is doing his thing separately while the others all go with Alustin. And he tops the sand dune and looks around, and then they see this creature. Godric can smell it before he sees it. And then let's see. 50 feet away, something that looked like a massively oversized sunling with claw-tipped tentacles trailing from its edges circled around the dune, regaining altitude for another dive. That, said Alustin, who hadn't moved at all, is a sunwing, which is a terrible name given how easy it is to confuse with sunling. The two sounded nothing alike in the language they were originally named in, apparently. Thankfully, they're more often referred to as Sunmaws these days. Still an awful name, but much easier to distinguish. And it's leaf-shaped, 8 feet across and 15 feet long. And I'm imagining it as sort of like a, what are those like rays that kind of float in the ocean? Stingray. But like instead of having that tail that they do, it's got like the claws sort of on the outside. And they apparently can process sunlight the same way sunlings do, but they also eat meat. And it's pretty clear that Alustin knew where this was and brought them here specifically to go up against it. And it turns out it's really, really resistant to magic, so they have to find a different way to hurt it. And there's a moment here where Sabe is going to like use her ability, and she's like, I'll be able to do it this time. And I was sort of wondering, why do you think that here? And Godric steps in and says, you know what? I have an idea. We're going to do this differently. So Talia has a bolt of Dreamfire. Godric has his sledgehammer. And Sabe has her wind armor going. Talia launches the bolt, and before it came too close, it detonated in a burst of sparks. Sabe leapt, releasing a massive burst of air. It hurled her 20 feet in the air, then 30. The burst of wind knocked Talia over entirely, sent Alustin's hat flying off his face, and actually staggered Godric a little. He was able to throw him... unfortunately, Sabe went flying off in completely the wrong direction. Godric was about to throw himself to the ground as well, but then realized the burst of Dreamfire had caused the Sunmaw to drop considerably in altitude. So he throws his hammer and uses a spell form to speed it up and hit. And then Talia jumps up and has one of her like pieces of bone that she's growing and drops it into the creature's mouth, and it explodes and just sprays everybody with ichor. And this is when Alustin is like, yeah, okay, see, you thought for some reason you were just gonna master a technique in the middle of a battle when doing it in practice has been giving you trouble. You don't assume that. And I was so grateful for that, because so many stories have like a person who can't do the thing until they're faced with a life or death situation. And suddenly now they're able to do it because they're motivated properly in a way that they weren't by a hypothetical situation. Now that it's really down to the wire, they can suddenly pull it out. And that's just straight up almost never how it goes. Actually, what winds up happening a lot of the time is when you are in a particularly stressful situation, something that you're normally good at will be harder because you are under a type of pressure. Not always, granted, but a lot of the time. So I would always get kind of frustrated when that trope was like trotted out that, oh yeah, well, he's been attempting this one like karate move this whole time and he could never get it. But now that he's finally like facing up against the bully to defend his friend, now he's able to execute it perfectly. And I'm always just like, oh, God, whatever. So it was really funny to have Sabe be so sure, like, no, this time I'll get it. And she's really, really wrong. I don't like to laugh at you, Sabe, because honestly, I like you a lot. But Alustin was right to be mad at you here. And he says, like, you can't just... It says improvising using already learned techniques is to be encouraged, but learning mid-battle is not the same thing. And she accuses him of teaching Hugh to do that. And he says, no, I'm teaching him skills that he can improvise with. It's the difference between knowing how to use a tool for a lot of different tasks and having a lot of tools for different tasks that you don't know how to use. And that makes sense to me. So then we go to Canderon. And Canderon is, and I do enjoy the fact, by the way, that her dialogue is always in bold because she's just so fucking big. That her voice is also so fucking big. And she sees Hugh and is like, so you've been going through some shit, huh? And he tells her the stories of everything that has happened. And then she asks him whether his crystal affinity skills are advancing. And he says, I've come up with some things that help me move the bracelets, but they're not real efficient. And she asks him to draw them out, which he does. And she looks at him and is like, these are really very tiresome to hold in your head all day. I wouldn't want to do this. And he says, well, then what should I be doing? And then she says, if I had my way about it, I'd leave you to batter away at the problem, but I'm not going to be around to teach you for a while. Theristel and its environs are the territory of Indra's Stormbreaker. I avoid entering her territory without permission, just as she avoids Skyhold without mine. And it says here, hearing that Canderon and Indra's Stormbreaker, the legendary dragon queen, had a standoff, was immediately humbling to Hugh. And I was like, I was a little surprised at that interpretation of it. Just being like, I don't have her permission to enter her territory, and the two of them being in a standoff, those aren't necessarily the same thing. A standoff implies that the two of you are rivals that have sort of come to a point where neither of you can continue to move forward. But it just sounds to me like Canderon is respecting the fact that she has a territory that she guards and sees as hers, and Canderon feels the same way, and they just sort of acknowledge that and try not to step on each other's toes. And that's, I don't know. I felt like he leapt to a conclusion there that was not at all how I took that statement. So then she's like, so here is the spell you'll use. And she draws it, and Hugh is like, what the fuck is this? And he thinks that he's going to have to hold this in his mind all day. And she says, no, this is going to establish a link between your mana reservoirs and the ether crystal. You'll have to manually turn off that link with another spell form. And she tells him to copy them down and asks him to cast them. And he does. It's really hard. And she warns him, don't get it wrong, or it could potentially really fuck you up. So he does. And then all of a sudden he can feel the bracelets like they're an extension of himself. And he's like, whoa, this is incredibly rad. And then he sort of stops and is like, wait, how was I supposed to figure this out? The link here that you've given me in this spell form wasn't even something that I knew to be possible. How did you want me to develop anything without knowing this? And she says, oh, you weren't. It was just an exercise in problem solving and spellcraft. Maybe you wouldn't have gotten the correct solution, but it would push your skills forward. This is one of those things that I'm just like, I don't know, man. I want to be like, Canderon, you creative and sneaky devil coming up with a way. But honestly, giving somebody a problem that they literally can't solve, that is going to drag them down in a very literal but also mental way, I just feel like that's kind of a fucked up move. I don't know. Understandably, he was certainly not a fan. But he's able to dodge a lot better because he is sensing the crystal a little bit more. And then she teaches him one last thing, pattern linking. This is the spell I've been using to grow the crystals below the sand. It's in fact the only spell I use to grow crystals at all. The fundamental philosophy behind much of crystal-attuned spellcasting is making spell forms unnecessary. Spell forms may be the most easily accessible method of shaping mana, but it's far from the only method. Crystal-attuned mages have over the centuries developed methods to use as few spell forms as possible, as well as making the ones we do use as versatile as possible. And this was interesting because like the spell form thing had been sort of, for me, I kept thinking this seems so tricky and difficult and limiting. And so I appreciated finding out that there are other ways to do this. And, you know, understandably, depending on your attunement, it seems like it's going to look really different. So most of the crystal spell forms in that book operate under the same basic spell form construction principles Alestin taught you in the first place. You'll be able to devise variants and new versions of those to your heart's content. And as for the more versatile crystal affinity spells such as pattern linking, I will consider teaching you how to alter design spells like that someday. And Hugh says just consider it, and she gets a little bit salty and he has to be like, Master, and kind of signal his respect again, because it sounds to her like he's questioning her methods, and she doesn't care for that. She's very sort of old-fashioned in the absolute obedience that she expects from a student. So this is when we go to Sabe's perspective, and they're all experiencing these terrible sunburns, and eventually Sabe, they ask her, like, can you heal these for us? Because Sabe is like, she had fucked up. It says something like she had caused almost as much damage as she had solved when she tried to heal Godric from his injuries in the labyrinth. And we don't get a lot of detail about that, but I really want to know, like, what did she do? I would like hearing more about that. But it's fine. She's apparently going to try this, even though she's still very hesitant to use that affinity. But anyway, this is a point where she hears voices. She couldn't make out anything they were saying. She frowned, wondering if she'd hurt her ears somehow. But as they ascended the ship's ramp, she realized the voices were speaking in a different language. When she climbed off the ramp onto the deck, she spotted Eric and another crew member talking to each other, looking like they were gossiping. And they look really happy about something, but then they spot her and Alestin and the others, and they look flipped out. And Delia comes running up and is calling them idiots and says, you know better than to... And then she just like grabs them by the ears and drags them below decks. And Sabe says to Alestin, what the fuck was that? And even Hugh is looking like they might be in trouble and is looking really anxious. So Alestin is like, they're not allowed to speak their language in front of outsiders because it was one of the only languages to survive the Ithonian Empire's purges. And Sabe is like, the what? And Alestin is really surprised that none of them know what he's talking about. And is like, huh, interesting that that's not been part of your education. And I'm like, it is interesting, isn't it, Alestin? Isn't it interesting that we haven't been taught about how the dominant culture erased the fucking languages of peoples that it decided to obliterate and force into assimilation? It's so weird that that isn't something that a school would teach its students about its own history, about the country's founding. And, you know, this shit not having happened all that long ago is treated like it was fucking centuries earlier, and really we were doing this in the fucking 60s and 70s. So, as you can all tell, I am no longer talking about the book. I am talking about Native peoples and, government schooling and all of that. Y'all, this is a really brutal bit. When Hugh hears like they destroyed languages, he thinks that what Alustin means is they weren't allowed to speak their own language, which is certainly how it is in reality. But Brian was like, no, we're going to take this, or John, sorry, I don't know where I got Brian. John Bierce is like, we're going to do you one better and create spells that literally destroy and eat a language, which is really intense. This is rough. We have no idea how they did it. Language is an affinity that no one is born with and can only be developed deliberately, like planar affinities. They took the secrets of how to develop language attunements to their grave as a civilization. They used the language attunements to develop strange spells, and the most powerful was known as the Tongue Eater. It was an insanely difficult piece of grand magic, taking dozens or hundreds of mages to cast each time. But when it was cast, the spell would begin to eat the language it was targeted at. And he describes how doing this basically disembowels entire cultures, and histories just begin to fall apart, which is indeed how that goes. But that wasn't all. Anyone who only spoke a language targeted by the Tongue Eater lost language entirely, and they became little more than feral beasts. No one was ever capable of teaching them another language after they lost it, and people who had learned Ithonian but lost their first language to the Tongue Eater were lessened somehow. They became less intelligent, less motivated, and more obedient. It was as if they'd had some vital spark of life taken from them. Many mages afflicted this way, interestingly, often lost some of their attunements or even all of them. Ooh, that is a bleak picture, kiddos. That is very, very scary sounding. Like, this is truly, you hear the tales of some big magical spell that's like really intimidating and frightening, and it's so often a physical thing, and this is so much worse. It's so colonizery, and it is so, I'm gonna completely steal your humanity from you, and it's like a really distilled and focused version of how that shit actually goes when you do this to people and take part of their history and their way of expressing themselves away from them. The Rodhan only kept their language alive by hiding it and making the Ithonians think they'd willingly adopted their language entirely. The tradition has become part of their culture to this day. They speak Ithonian around strangers, but only Rodhan among themselves. And this sort of reminded me of the Romani. And, I'm not going to speak too much on this because I am not super familiar. But from what I have read, the Romani are very sort of tight-lipped about their language around strangers, people who are not of that bloodline, and they have a whole way of communicating with one another that is very fluid. So outsiders who think they have learned the language begin to see that it's being used differently around them, and it's just sort of adaptable to keep outsiders from being able to really learn it easily. And it's part of the way they have managed to preserve what they can of their culture, because so much else of it has been taken away from them, robbed from them. But yeah, this is a really it's a really genius idea, to be honest. It got to me. Let's see. Ms. T says, Alestin says language affinities have to be developed. Nobody is born with it, same as planar, but our boy has planar. Right, but he got it from and Dan answers you. He got it from Kandaran, who developed it at some point, right? Yeah. Magic weapons of mass destruction are rough. And yeah, it's a wild thing because it's a magic weapon of mass destruction, but not the kind of destruction you would think of when you imagine that. You know, when I think of mass destruction, think of obviously a bomb, because that is how Americans think. And the idea that it's a destruction of like a complete people that manages to sort of divorce many of them from their humanity, at least partially, if not entirely. Wow. That's just so upsetting. And I'm really curious about like the Ithonians as a people overall, because he says they took it to their graves. So they were defeated, I guess, eventually. But we don't really know like a lot about how all that happened. So I'm assuming that probably more of that will begin to come out. But yikes, just yikes. So it ends with Talia saying, can you use your healing affinity? And Sabé is just like, all right, come on. And it ends with Sabé was buying a hat the instant they arrived in Theristel. And I will tell you guys what, because I am a dodo bird who was starting to think a little bit too magically. I was like, a hat for what? Does that make her magic stronger? No, babe. It's just a hat to keep the sun off of her. It's just a regular old hat doing a regular old hat thing. But I got myself caught up thinking that this was like something. I just took it a little too far. So, yeah, that is the end of chapter 9. And I was just really taken aback by this reveal. The way that and I appreciate too Sabé kind of stopping and thinking, I guess it is sort of weird that we are all from totally different areas and yet we all speak the same language. Because one, that's just a nice way for the author to explain something like that and kind of have an in-world explanation for it. But also, I like that it sort of mirrors, I think, an experience a lot of us have as we begin to look at the ways in which white supremacy and colonization have dictated so much of the way we do things. You will not have really asked the question to begin with, why do we do this thing this way? And then you will learn the reason why and suddenly step back and go, oh my God, I never even wondered why. And I should have, because that's weird, right? And that is part of the critical thinking thing that begins to happen the more you understand how history affects the present. And this is what's so difficult about talking with certain people who don't want to acknowledge history, because they act like the past is the past, and it's not. The past is the present too. And if you don't ask these questions, you don't fully understand why things are the way they are. And if you're not asking those questions and someone's trying to tell you and you're refusing to hear it, then you don't want to know why things are the way they are, which is highly sus. Why don't you? What's wrong with knowing that? What's wrong with asking the questions and getting information, even if it's not pleasant? You know, this is something that I have run into a few times with some of Owen's family. It's like, I'll reference something and not even be intending to have like a big conversation about it, but just be like, well, that's what happens when such and such. And it is really interesting to see the way some people react to something that is just fucking demonstrably true but unpleasant being said out loud. And they just act like I'm being really indelicate. And it's like, this was already part of the conversation, but now that I'm actually getting to the point, I'm being offensive somehow. Well, the facts are offensive. That's just something that we have to like learn to cope with, and we are not doing great at that. So I'm just really fascinated to learn more about the history of this place. And I'm curious, like the fact that Alustin wasn't aware that they didn't know about this. I'm wondering if this is going to get back to anybody at the school, and if he's going to be like, hey, why aren't you teaching this? Or anything like that, you know? All right, I'm going to wrap up, but thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Thank you again, Dan, for commissioning this. This has been really fun. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.